And our speaker is Elizabeth Yakel, who is also our advisory board member. She is professor of information at the University of Michigan and specialized in digital archives and curation and data reuse and many other interesting things. She has recently published, for example, Defining a Discipline, Archival Research and Practice in the 21st Century, 2020, and also Contextualizing Archival Literacy, 2016. And your title today is Digital Cultural Heritage Repair, Respect and Relationship. So the floor is yours. Thank you in advance.
Good morning or good afternoon to you. I want to thank you for inviting me to talk today and also for inviting me to be part of the advisory board of your really exciting project. And I'm very interested to hear how the project progresses and how you're thinking about digital historicity changes over the course of the project. Today, I'm going to talk about digital cultural heritage. As I was preparing this talk, I decided I would really add another R word, representation. So I'm going to talk about representation, respect, repair, and relationship. And representation, this talk really got me thinking a lot about the article I wrote many years ago on archival representation and how I feel at this point that article is incomplete. And I'm going to talk a little bit in this talk about where I think I would go with that if I were to rewrite it today. So there are different representational issues in archives. There's misrepresentation, whether it's accidental or purposeful. There's lack of representation, and there are issues around authority and power of who is representing. And I want to go over those for all of us just to begin. The power to name, also the name of a book by Hope Mayo. It's very powerful. I was asked to talk specifically about gender issues, and so I've sprinkled those within this talk. In the US, issues of race are probably more salient at this point, but there still are embedded issues around gender, which we have to deal with. The power to name. Many collections in the US, for example, will be named by the male head of the family, the John Smith papers. More recently, even if there are papers of Maggie Smith, who in the collection, the default seems to be that these are slowly being named something like the Smith family papers, or they're named the John and Maggie Smith papers. Rarely do we see the Maggie and John Smith papers. But even that title, thinking about how it's formed and why it's formed, it is something to think about. There's also misrepresentation beyond naming in terms of how we think collections should be ordered and what that order is. There are lots of different examples out there. My favorite example is the Alexander Winchell papers. I've provided a copy of my slides. There's a link in them. What's interesting about these papers is that they came to the archives and archives at the University of Michigan in one order, but the archivist decided that that wasn't a very good order. and reordered them. And then about a decade ago, tried to reconstruct the original order that they came in. What's interesting in the finding aid is that there's a whole discussion of what's happened to these papers over time. So misrepresentation isn't just what is said, it can be much more insidious into things that have happened, the provenance of the collection over time. Even when things are there, there's still lack of representation. There are evolving ideas about what is worth collecting. We've gone through a periods of collecting in the US just great white men, and then we decided great white women were good to collect, great Black men, great Black women. But that still leaves most of humanity out of the picture. So that one thing is, how are we, what do our collections represent and what are they intended to represent? And who should be collecting? We have heard from many archival scholars about not just collecting the records, but supporting communities in creating archives or doing what they think best for their archival collections. Michelle Caswell, Andrew Flynn have been at the forefront of thinking about community archives. Representation also becomes interesting when we think about what does it mean to have a strong collection. And I think about this, for example, aboutness versus by. A couple of my students at the University of Michigan recently did an analysis of collections of Blacks in the University of Michigan archives. And on the one hand, you could say, well, there are over 100 collections that, are collecting materials that concern Black life. The problem is that the larger collections are really about Blacks. They're the white community telling us about the Black community. On average, the collections that are actually by Blacks are, much less than a linear foot. Like, I'm not sure what it is in centimeters, but really a couple inches. So you have dozens of these very small collections that are actually by Blacks, which could be good, but they don't have a lot of depth. And what we found is that subject headings can misrepresent density and depth of collections. There'll be very large collections that will have a subject heading that they do represent Blacks, but it's really one folder in a larger collection. So lack of representation comes in different forms. The authority and power in representation, I don't think can be, we can't put that aside. Melissa Adler has called for taxonomic reparations. This is, I'll use US examples here, but it's very acute in the US. And since archivists in the US use things like the Library of Congress subject headings, they're very pertinent to the archival community. Recently in the US, there was actually a fight, and the US Congress got in the middle of it about the Library of Congress wanting to get rid of the subject heading illegal aliens, which is a term which in the US has now become almost weaponized. Actually, the term began in the early 20th century before the actual codification of the Library of Congress subject headings. But as the library wanted to provide a less, I don't know what I want to say, a less flagrant subject heading for this, people got involved and it became very political. It went out of the professional realm. It finally was taken away several years ago. But there's still a lot of gendered terminology in the Library of Congress subject headings. For example, to represent same-sex couples, one might want to use spouses, legal status, laws, but that redirects us to the husband and wife subject heading, which really leaves no room for same-sex pairs. And here I've put the definition or the explanation of the subject heading there. So there's really no way within this, thousands of pages of subject headings to currently represent same-sex couples. Other problems in representation is how do we handle original folder titles from businesses, organizations, individuals that have racist, classist, gendered folder headings. And this is handled in very different ways across the US. Some archives keep them, some change them, but provide a transparent trail of what they were originally. But there's a lot of work going on in thinking about how do you let people know, and how, because people, again, don't often understand that these were coming from the original. But there are lots of, even within the Library of Congress subject headings, there are a lot of gendered assumptions, cross-references to men, or for human being, male human being, manly. For women, there are female attendant, mistress, wife, charm. So very, very gendered. And we're trying to move toward a more gender inclusive language, but there's a long way to go. Also, what we'll find, and I think this is particularly in finding aids and archival descriptions, is that there can also be language misrepresentations, referring to women by describing them by their relationships. She's someone's daughter, someone's wife. Whereas if you were describing men, you would not do it that way. I even found one example of someone describing women's achievements in terms of social institutions regulated by men, that a woman who was went on a lot of adventures and did a lot of travel was referred to as a fiancée of danger. So, I mean, something that you would never see a man described as. So does our, and also does our descriptive language sustain gendered stereotypes? If we're looking at older finding aids, how are people described? And do we need that type of description? Docile women, or boasting women, which give us different ideas about that. I think also within our representation that we're moving, or we've moved from questioning assumptions about gendered language, that we realize that they're gendered language, but now also in our society, there are a lot of assumptions about gender. So there's a lot that's evolving in terms of how we want to kind of think about past description and current description and thinking about that into the future. Getting more into the archival area, I like the conceptualization by Wendy Duff and Vern Harris of liberatory descriptive standards. that are user-centered. They can be community-driven. They may even be co-created. But what they emphasize is that there's transparency about these processes, that any biases are made explicit, that we're holding creators and archivists accountable, and that in the end that we have some affirming and open-ended. So we do see some of the language in our finding aids as needing constant monitoring and revision. It isn't a description that will hold for the ages. And I think, as I've said before, that we're moving from maybe authority control to some type of shared authority. And that means that there's a change in the role of the archivist. The archivist is not only a mediator or a moderator, but also a member. And one that has to be open to embracing community-driven initiatives. In the US, Native Americans have generated a community-generated thesaurian classification guides. The one by Littletree and Matoyer is probably the most used, but that they've been able to think about how they want to describe their nation, their Native American nation and their peoples in their own words. And I think those are the types of community-driven initiatives that we need to support and embrace. I agree with Alexandra Cohn and Dong McKinnon that we can no longer just say about description that it's of its time, that that's no longer acceptable, that we have to make changes. And I think that's part of thinking about how we respect not only the records, but the communities that are, and the individuals that are represented in those records. And that can include acknowledging harm and engaging those communities in some kind of repair, which I'll talk about next. And I think that, this is the area that I think in my original work, archival representation, that I did not understand the harm that some of the representations have caused over time. In the US, many archives and libraries have taken to developing statements on harmful language. This is one example from the New York State Archives, their statement on harmful language in the in descriptive resources. And I provided you with a link to lists on very different statements. The Cohn and McKinnon article actually focuses on these statements and some of the differences in the statements. And we're also seeing kind of the emergence of archival communities, the white archival communities coming forward and acknowledging the harm. This is from Canada, the Steering Committee on Canada's Archives, the kind of reconciliation framework, the response to the report on the Truth and Reconciliation Task Force. And they have 8 principles. These 2 are talking specifically about acknowledging harm and calling for co-creation in descriptive work around collections. So I think we're moving not just from shared authority, but to a more distributed curation, where archivists are sharing, letting go of, kind of acknowledging lack of cognitive authority in at least certain areas, particularly around collections dealing with communities whom they are not part of. And so we move on to repair. And I don't think it's just what we say. That's kind of the micro level. It's how we say it. It's thinking about what descriptive equity is. And I think understanding that this isn't just a micro, we'll tweak our language, that it's more systemic than that within our institutions. Conan McKinnon, again, have talked about descriptive equity, and they see that there are three aspects to this. There's kind of the diversification of archives, both in terms of collection and archivists. Beyond description, there's also advocacy and promotion in understanding why choices have been made and how those have affected the collection to try to create a better utilization. There is reparative archival description that is part of this, describing and naming whiteness rather than solely including racial descriptions of non-white individuals. Describing and contextualizing racist or problematic language, and again, echoing Duff and Harris, being transparent by preserving that evidence of racism in legacy description. Getting rid of it and pretending it never happened doesn't help anyone. That we do need to keep that not only provenance of the records, but provenance of archivist professional relationships to those records over time. And finally, a third point in descriptive equity is naming the subjects of the records to the same extent as the creators. So again, understanding the community. Let's see. Okay. In terms of reparative description, I like this quote by Johnson, Drake, and Caswell that memory work isn't just about remembering the past, but it's reckoning with it. And whatever that is, establishing the facts, acknowledging, apologizing, and working towards repairing any harm that was done. It may mean understanding counter narratives, but I think we have to do it so as not to repeat the mistakes in the future. And one thing about this is that revised description isn't the end goal, that this idea of advocacy, education, and being transparent is important for any future utilization of the records. A group in Philadelphia, Archives for Black Lives, has developed a manual, what they call anti-racist descriptive resources, and given guidance into how to think about what kind of repair is needed. For example, unlearn the neutral voice. Their argument is that whites have hidden behind this idea that archivists are neutral, that they're creating these finding aids in very objective ways, but that hasn't been true. Use active phrasing, accentuate, the human in description. It isn't, for example, their example is documents the business dealings of a Black woman named Maria to documents the business dealings of Maria, a Black woman. So really naming that person as an individual. This was a human. Using accurate and direct language and describing any relationships of power that are important for understanding the collections. What this leads us to is that, as I've argued, these aren't just questions of fixing our language, that there really is systemic problems in the past and that we have inherited and must deal with in the present. Fricker has called this epistemic injustice. And there are two types, she claims, of testimonial injustice, when prejudice causes a hearer to give deflated credibility to a speaker's word, and hermeneutical injustice, a gap in collective interpretive resources that puts someone at an unfair disadvantage. Melanson has brought this to the archives, and he notes that there are unique ways in which those who work in institutions like archives are involved in social knowledge practices that can cause unjust harms to marginalized people, but we also have unique opportunities to repair those injustices. And he would argue that some of our lack of incorporating communities into helping to, or even describing their collections for us, is part of that epistemic injustice that's gone on in the past. You know, to repair not just the collections, but the relationships with the communities documented in the collections, we really need to think about action. In the Canadian reconciliation framework, a lot of the principles deal with what action is going to be taken. Principle 2, commitment to the processes of truth-telling, reconciling, and ongoing relationship building. You know, we also need to think again systemically about archival power and authority, moving from targeted actions to perhaps thinking about what institutional processes do we need to change to continually address respect and relationship. And finally, as Lael Hughes Watson has argued, that thinking about reparative description isn't enough, but we really want to think about a reparative archive as a whole. Some final thoughts. You know, as I said, I snuck in representation because it is something that I have been thinking about for a while and put down, and this talk has made me come back to it. In revisiting it, I think, you know, as I said, I think I missed what the effects of misrepresentation and lack of representation and holding on to the power of representation are. That we really do need to think about harm and what harm has been caused and acknowledge that and move forward in whatever way, whether it's the archives alone or the archives in conjunction with communities. That we have to better understand what the practices of repair are, and that maintaining, rebuilding relationships with the communities that our archives represent are central to what we're doing. In terms of relationship, I've talked a lot about kind of the social worlds within, for example, Archives 2.0 and building relationships that way. But that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of communities and how we can relate, and also communities that perhaps we haven't done as deep harm to as we have to communities that are racial, different races, communities, the gender issues that we now understand, and class issues. So I think with those four kind of broad concepts, I will leave you, and I look forward to the commentary and any questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, we asked Ihab Saloul to have a short commentary first, and then we open the discussion for.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture, and also specifically for us as a bunch of semioticians and narrative people, and also archivists, kind of actually warning us or flagging few things that we should be aware of before actually we start on the mission of archiving itself. So I appreciate actually that you added another keyword of representation to your lecture. It wasn't originally in the title, because this whole idea of representation, as we know, this was like one of the main concepts that we're still struggling with in the humanities since our Renaissance, let's say. So we haven't solved the problem of representation. I don't think there's still a clear solution of that issue, but I think also what you have tried to give to us is also a kind of awareness of the agency of the archivist or the archiving process, as well as the acknowledgement of the subject positioning of the archivist. So these for me are crucial terms. Let's say also working or coming from a narrative or narrative theory scholarship, I think that whole idea of working with the voice and who's speaking when we are dealing with the notion of archive, this is very important for our discussion. We've been, in fact, dealing with this idea of the whole formation of a particular historical construction of a particular history or a particular form of knowledge. This was part of our discussion throughout the day, and I think in this regard your lecture comes exactly in the right moment to tell us actually about the way that we practice or dealing with these kind of collections. So I appreciate that, and actually I want to highlight maybe one thing and then open the discussion after that. The whole idea of lack of representation and who represents is also important to this idea of the provenance of the collections, and also that the realization of what do collections represent and who collects. What you said, it's the idea about the engagement or the difference between the archiving about people and archiving by people. So I appreciate this whole notion of co-creation in terms of design. This is something that we, I think that will be part of our project for a long time to go. But also I want to, maybe this a small question to you. In many ways, archiving, that we archive things, and we think that we are the power that holds the agency and can also determine, let's say, the image of the one that is being represented. However, in many ways, also the way that we archive also says something about us. It also says something about who we are. So actually, it also exposes our own identity as the agents of archiving. So I'm wondering, like, how can you see this relationship, like dual relationship between, let's say, your perspective from saying, okay, be careful that this can happen from this direction, but vice versa, the collection or the wrong archiving method or the practice can also say about something about the people who already conducted these archives. So I'm just trying to say that the collection is not as static as we assume it. It can also highlight the mistakes or the misrepresentation in this case, or the lack of representation, also by saying something about who did that work in the first place. Sorry, it's just a matter of conversation. It's not a But maybe you want to reflect on that aspect as well, that the power is not just in the agency of the archiving, but also the archived can also have its own agency.
No, thank you. I appreciate the commentary and the, you know, how much thought you've put into this and to reflect on your own, you know, past work and present work. You know, I agree. I don't think the archive is a static thing. I think it's reimagined by different generations of archivists. It's reimagined every time someone uses the archive, someone writes a paper, publishes something on it. You know, we have a changing view of what that collection is over time. It's not just how it's been described, but also users and use, and they aren't static. I think also archival descriptions aren't static, that they evolve over time. And if they don't, they're kind of orphan descriptions, just like we say we have orphan, you know, orphan collections. They're orphan descriptions that are no longer valid or relevant. So I think both of those are important. In terms of, you know, you talk, I liked what you said about how we archive exposes our own identity. And yes, I would definitely agree with that, and exposes identity over time. And it is something to think about. It's not just the historian that interprets the archive. And I think that's the idea of the archivist as neutral, objective, unbiased, and just kind of saying what they saw in the collection, and being, you know, some kind of transparent body that just delivers the collection from the collection to the user without any filters is just wrong. And I think multiple archival writers have talked about that we do reveal ourselves through those descriptions. And I think that's why the group from Philadelphia, in talking about, you know, get rid of the neutral language, you know, the passive, in English, kind of using the passive voice isn't good. Just say the archivist did this because the archivist did that. That those are important things of owning, you know, owning your work as an archivist. And sometimes that work you make mistakes and you know, you have to repair those mistakes. I don't, you know, I guess I'm a big believer in, you know, working through, you know, issues, that, you know, yes, you're going to make mistakes. Yes, you may cause harm, or you may not recognize the harm that was caused in the past, but you can repair it and you can take steps to do that. And that's what we have to think about.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I just want to open the discussion in a minute, but just to elaborate this idea that the ability to archive and the power to archive also entails the moral and the ethical mission, and that's actually an important notion that you're bringing into our discussion, is not just to accept the description of its own time or of its time, but also to try to adjust or to modify or actually to fix or to repair all these things. And that's important maybe in the two forms of injustices that you brought to our attention, between the epistemic and the hermeneutic injustice. But maybe I just want to tease our discussion a tiny bit and ask you about a keyword that I think it's very important in what you brought to us today, is the notion of accountability. And actually, that we are, as an intellectual or data scientist or archival scientist, etc., who can actually do things, who can make us accountable before actually committing the injustice? That's for maybe if you have an idea about, of course, it's not a solution, but it's looking for something like best practices from your own experience, how actually to make sure that we have some accountability in any kind of digitizing or archiving process.
Yeah, I think there are different levels of accountability. There's personal accountability and just, professional reflection on your own actions. There are ethical codes. Almost every archival organization that I know has a code of ethics, and many of those organizations have revised them or are revising them very recently in light of things. There have been different, particularly around Indigenous peoples, there have been different protocols and that have been issued in different countries, in Australia, Canada, the US. I'm sorry, I'm less familiar with kind of Western Europe and protocols that may have been issued there. So there are, there are guides out there. Some professional organizations will sanction people. I don't know if I think there are more carrots in US phraseology, there are more carrots than sticks.
Yeah.
In terms of making sure people are accountable, but certainly, professional organizations, when, particularly when they don't feel institutions have been accountable, have, written statements against the institutions. So I don't think there's a real robust professional sanctioning, but certainly there are a lot of carrots and guidance that's out there. And something you said early on, yes, archivists need to kind of change things, but there are communities out there that really want to help us change things. And that, and help us, find where we have, erred in the past, and to come to an agreement because in the end, it helps the communities. They are better represented. So, yes, we want to make sure that our own houses are in order, but there are communities that are more than willing to kind of help us do this, and we should embrace that.
Thank you. Yeah. And maybe now if there's any question, yeah, Marek, maybe.
James.
Marek first order.
Marek and then Mila. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very kind of comprehensive and clear overview of all the risks and problems involved in the very process of archiving. I was wondering what happens if we add the digital dimension, in the sense that what happens if we digitize the existing archives, and what kind of injustices or epistemic injustices or misrepresentations or various harms can happen during and after digitizing archives. Because I mean, it's a very practical question, because one part of the project is to digitize one personal archive, and already we are raising questions, for instance, that on the one hand, if a digitized archive, it might mean that you marginalize the physical archive, because nobody will visit the archive once it's available online. But on the other hand, the whole process of categorization, of metadata creation of a digital archive, this brings along a lot of probably various misrepresentations or various epistemic injustices. So whether you have any experience and many ideas or suggestions how to digitize very carefully and responsibly a personal archive.
I think the digitization of archives and the increasing digitization even of finding aids really started this movement of looking at what they really said and what was really there. Because it's one thing to have something in a physical archive where, you know, maybe 100 people come through and look at something during a year. And it's another when it's out there for anyone on the globe to see it. And I think a different level of scrutiny has gone into our collections, which is good as things are digitized. So I think it's just, you know, thinking, looking, you know, I know that you're dealing with, you know, very famous creatives in your project. I'm not sure what is in the archives. I'm not sure if there is a community that you can consult about some of the areas of the collections that you feel may have issues with them. I mean, that's one thing to do some pre-scoping prior to digitization. And you know, maybe you can, you know, redo certain areas that you think are problematic. I would assume that it would be not the whole collection, but, you know, perhaps certain areas. I also, you know, yes, digitization may marginalize the physical records, but I guess I would push back against thinking that online users are less than, you know, physical users that come to your collection. I think we're probably very bad at arguing that with the people that fund us if no one's coming to our physical collections. But, you know, thousands of people will be able to use it and use it not only in published works, but you will be probably exponentially gaining users who are using it in coursework or in education, in very different ways. I don't know what's in the collections exactly, but maybe more genealogical work. I mean, I think it's understanding the breadth of work. You can, you know, classes at the University of Michigan will be able to go into the letters and maybe learn more about the creative writing process by doing that. These kind of unknown uses and unexpected uses that would never be, you know, the classes at the University of Michigan aren't going to be able to go to the archives in Europe for the week to go see the physical collection. So I you know, there are trade-offs, but I think those trade-offs are worth it to digitize and to, you know, it's the archives as an institution. We all have to argue for our existence constantly and get funds. I think we have to get a lot more creative about figuring out some of these metrics and, you know, the measures that a lot of the administrators above us like.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mila? Mila and then Hanui.
Well, actually, Marek stole my question. Yeah, but maybe I could just kind of like, I really like the way you kind of like also describe what it allows, kind of like what digitization allows us to do and what kinds of like new user groups maybe and new ways. And I was just kind of like thinking, especially as you were talking about that a lot of representations come in different forms and also describing how different people leave different types of kind of like collections. Some of them are narrow, some of them are kind of like larger, and so on. So perhaps there is an opportunity also to kind of like, if we digitize these collections, to break them into kind of like into pieces that then allow us to look at them from more varied kind of like perspectives. But yeah, thanks.
I know, maybe.
Yep. Any more questions, or do I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking. Actually, Marek stole my question as well. But of course, there is. I was interested in the idea of reparative description, and of course, what will happen in the digitization process is that we also produce new metadata, something that didn't exist before, and it's something that we have to concentrate on how to do it, and in how it relates to the previous metadata level that we have. But do you have any experiences in those kinds of processes, how metadata can be like more reflective towards the earlier sediments of the collections?
So Elizabeth, there's two more questions, but maybe you can answer these two first, and then we take two more. Okay? Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to be quick. I think it's just being careful with new, metadata. I think that, as I was pointing out in the Library of Congress subject headings, if you're using standardized subject headings to question, the construction of those, because even, there are still sediments in the Library of Congress subject headings that are very gendered, racist, classist. So, I think it's just really thinking about it. But I do agree with Duff and Harris that, particularly if you're changing metadata, you may want to capture that. And you want to capture, definitely if you're changing anything that came from the creator, to diminish any harm that someone might see in your digitization initially, that they do have access to know, what's there and what was changed. That I think we need to, this is part of the accountability, is the transparency.
Thank you, Marlene.
Hi. First of all, thank you for an interesting lecture. It was really thought-provoking. And I actually wanted to build up a little bit on Marek's question, also about when archives are digitalized. My experience in archive is that it is so very useful to be able to go to someone who has such expert knowledge on a collection, where you can ask all kinds of questions, contextualization, can even provide some emotional guidance even when necessary. And I was wondering about what are your thoughts on the archivist being taken out of the digital archive, and how that actually impacts then how people can engage with the digital archive? Maybe a big question.
Yeah. I mean, I do think archivists add value. They can tell you a lot of the little things about the collections, of what's there, or, how to even navigate, collections, particularly if they're large collections. I don't think that should stop us from digitizing. I think it makes us look almost at the system in which the digital archives are delivered in. Can you chat with an archivist? I mean, if you go to any, I hate to say this, if you go to any commercial site, they're like, there's someone here to chat with you if you have a question. I think you maybe have to be a little bit more forceful that there is someone, back there who can help you. If you do have a question, or if there's not an ongoing chat, how do you contact someone if you have a question? to do the, you know, I rarely do them, but, you know, pop-up surveys of the people using it to see what are the issues. I think there are other things you can do, that digitizing and just throwing it out there without thinking about what's the entire ecosystem, I don't think is any good. I think we do have to be better promoters of our expertise. I mean, although I kind of argued that we should give up some of that cognitive authority, I don't think we should give all of it up. And I think archivists do have a lot of knowledge and cognitive authority that we can retain. We just have to promote it.
Thank you. Mario?
Yes, I will be really brief. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your presentation. It was really interesting and thought-provoking, as also my colleague said. I had two comments more than question, actually, and two, maybe if you can elaborate a little bit more about this idea of repair, because I really like the feminist approach that you adopted while you were talking about sort of like healing power of the archive, right? And like usually we think the archives as something, as we said, static, that like emotions have no space in this kind of institution, let's say. But I think like also thinking of the work by Anne Zerkovitz, An Archive of Feeling and the Visibility of Lesbian Popular Culture, I think that like emotion have a specific space in the way in which we reinterpret the materials that are present in the archive. And so my question is basically, long story short, if you can say a little bit more about this healing power of the archive in terms of repair and emotion. And then the second, like, follow up, a sort of footnote for us that, like, I really, as I said, liked this idea, this feminist lens that you adopted while you were talking about general questions related, general issues related to the archive. I think can be also a challenge for us that we are working with the archive, the Lotman's archive, to adopt a sort of feminist lens to refer to Zara means, not just like the wife or Yuri Lotman, and to understand better what kind of influence she had in the reflection, in the thoughts that he had while he wrote so important books and texts. So I think this can be also like a guide for us to adopt a feminist lens while we are like discussing these materials that are not never in academia. What we write is not the results of like a singular conversation, of course. It's always like a collaboration. And in this case, in the Yuri Lotman case, that means as like had an important role, and maybe this can be something that we can discuss further and further. Thank you.
Yeah, there are lots of emotions in the archives. There's the emotion of kind of seeing yourself represented in the archive, and, you know, positive emotions if you're seeing yourself represented in a good way, negative emotions if you're seeing yourself in a bad way. You know, there's emotions of even going into the archives. You know, everyone's mindset is the library. You can go in and wander around and, you know, get books, and you come into the archives and it's like sort of this prison atmosphere. Get rid of your backpack, get rid of your books, sign up. You know, you have to call collections. So there are all sorts of emotions going on with archival materials. There's, you know, finding aids, you know, who, you know, those are strange if you haven't worked with them a lot. But yeah, I think that, you know, you're right, that there can, you know, we can think about, you know, how do we generate, you know, better emotions and not, you know, not harm in the archives. Are we going to have to be able to eliminate all harm? No, because collections can be harmful. There are, and we have to, you know, admit that there are collections of, you know, Holocaust survivors. There are collections of, you know, orphan children. There are lots of collections that are going to elicit lots of different emotions from people. And I think that's the power of the archive. But, you know, we can't pretend that the archive is a place of no emotion and it's just the past and we can all look objectively at the past. No, we read ourselves into the past all the time. And, you know, I mean, that's, you know, that's part of the work of the archivist to decide how, you know, how to let people know who may not be familiar with an archive that that's going to happen. And I think the statements that I showed you from New York State Archives are, you know, that's just the kind of thing where archivists are trying to clue people in that we haven't removed all harm from here. That this is a place of emotion, but we are trying to, you know, if we've really misrepresented, we will acknowledge, and you know, there's generating harm is not the same as generating, you know, emotions that we might feel are negative. You know, someone, you know, I think they're two different things, and I think we have to separate those and let people know you might encounter both. We can do more repair. You know, we'll be doing more repair with one, but we can't protect you from everything negative in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
There is enough time, but
Ali,
I think,
Sorry?
yes.
Martin has.
Okay, maybe last question.
we'll try to
Martin?
be very quickly.
Yes.
Thank you for your speech. I kind of work with this idea of reparative archive. So on these digital spaces where digitized objects belonging to the colonial period are accessible in theory also to ex-colonized people. So these reparative archives, like digital reparative archives, are useful because they allow these marginalized people, okay, to rebuild their cultural identity. But on the other end, so this is the healing power, as Mario said, of digital archives. But on the other end, the real object, okay, remains under the control of like the ex-colonizers, okay, here in the Western countries. So, I mean, the digitizations processes present some risks, I think. No, I was thinking about that because before you were talking about not demonizing like digital users, online users. So what do you think about that?
You know, I think it varies from, you know, country to country on the colonizers versus the those who were colonized, on what their relationship with those records, you know, is, and what they want out of the relationship of the records. At the University of Michigan, actually, through the flukes of nature, we actually have a lot of records about the Philippines and the colonizers of the Philippines. Several of the, I don't know what they were, kind of adjunct generals who were in charge of the Philippines for the US ended up at the University of Michigan, and their collections ended up there. And several anthropologists at the University of Michigan studied the Philippines. And so recently we've engaged in a digitization process of the records and given those back to different archives in the Philippines, you know, for their use. And there was, you know, my colleagues did this. I did not do this personally. So I just have reports from them. But, you know, and this might not always be the case, but the archives in the Philippines were more than happy to get the digitized version rather than the real versions. And, you know, they've been able to incorporate those and then provide those. And they're easier to make copies now too for different communities. I think we even, for one community that was documented, we actually printed out the digitized resources and gave it as more of a book. So I think there are, it's really about the relationship and understanding the different communities and what their needs are and why they have certain needs and what those are vis-a-vis the records. And it might be that, they just want a say in, how they have been characterized in the records or what the finding aids say about the different peoples. So I think there's no, different peoples that were colonized have different needs and are different peoples, and we just have to figure that out on a kind of community by community basis. So I don't know what more to say than that. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. This was a wonderful discussion.
Okay.
And I hope to see you with us next year in person in Tallinn here. Hanu, Mila, you want to say something?
Yeah, we are very thankful for your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That gave us a lot of food for thinking. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
So good. Well, I thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope you have a good rest of your day and a productive seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yakel.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.